So we are in the beginning of a series on conflict resolution, and last week, if you were here, we talked about the predictable pattern of conflict, and we used the metaphor of spark, gasoline, fire. If you weren't here for that message, you can access it on YouTube and iTunes through our church website. So just go to our church website, which is printed on all of our documents, and then you can find the little link that says messages and follow that link, and there are hot links that will connect you to these different pages for the video and the audio. But this morning, we're going to talk about different responses to conflict. Some of those responses are healthy and God-honoring, and some of them are destructive and sinful. And so I want to go ahead and show the video that we played last week just to give you an idea of some different kinds of responses to conflict. Check it out. So have you ever said any of these things? Fine, we'll do it your way. It's your fault. If you would just do what I want to do, we wouldn't fight, right? There are all kinds of different responses to conflict, and the video that we just saw illustrates a couple of major pitfalls as we're trying to resolve conflict in a healthy way. There are actually two compulsive, sinful responses to conflict. And they're tied into our biology as human beings, in which when we face threat, our instinct is either to fight or flight, right? To either stand up and fight or to run away. So the fight reaction says, "You're wrong." You ever said that to someone? That's the fight reaction. You are wrong, and it tends to be a little forceful. The flight response says, I'm done. I'm out of here. I've had enough. And so if you check out the graphic on the worship screen, you'll see what's called the slippery slope of conflict. And on the left side, there is what are called escape responses. And then on the other side, at the opposite extreme, we have fight responses or assault responses. So what I want to do is I kind of want to just talk a little bit about both of those extremes so that we can map a middle way that's a little more healthy. So again, on the left side, we have escape responses. And this response says we need to avoid conflict at all costs. And when conflict is imposed upon us, and there's nothing that we can do about it, we need to run away as quickly as possible. And this escape response manifests itself in a couple of different concrete ways. And you've probably either practiced conflict resolution in this way or witnessed other people. But the first manifestation is denial. This is the proverbial ostrich with its head in the sand, right? Everything's fine. Let's not talk about it. Don't rock the boat. Don't stir the pot. And anybody who even acknowledges that there's conflict in a relationship is painted as unloving, as a troublemaker, and all these other things. Because people who have an escape response, they don't want to deal with conflict. Just get away from it. People like me like to lift up rocks and look underneath them. And someone who has escape responses will say, put that back down. Don't look at that. Let's just brush it under the rug, right? So this response is called denial. We just don't want to deal with it. That's one escape response. The second escape response is flight. So you try to avoid conflict at all costs, but when it shows up at your door, you try to run away as quickly as possible. And so trouble starts brewing at work. You don't want to deal with the conflict, and so you resign and find another job. Things aren't going well in a dating relationship. We have some teenagers here. And instead of having the wherewithal to deal with the conflict and process it in healthy ways, we say, you know what, it's just easier just to call it quits. And we walk away and we find someone else to date. There are some people who get married and they're always looking for an escape hatch. So when things get rough in the marriage, if they can't resolve the conflict, they just cash in their chips, divorce, and go find somebody else. And the problem with these two different kinds of escape responses, there are actually two problems. The first problem is that nothing is ever solved. Every conflict of any significance has a root cause. And if you don't deal with the root problem, that conflict will manifest itself in different ways over and over and over and over again. When I was young, and the caveat here is I don't know if this is true, so if you're a gardener and this is not true, just bear with me. But when I was young and I would pull weeds, which was not my favorite thing to do with my family on Saturday morning, much rather be surfing, my mom and dad would say, pull it up by the roots so that it doesn't just pop up a couple days later. Conflict is the same way. If we're not dealing with the root problem, then we're not going to have a lasting solution. And so what ends up happening is that trouble breaks out at work, and we quit that job, and we start another one, and guess what happens? The same kind of problems repeat themselves with different people. And then you say, well, I don't want to deal with this either. And so then you quit that job, and you get a new one, and guess what happens? You face the same problems with different people. It never really goes away. If you are married, or have been married, you know what it's like to have the same argument over and over and over again. And sometimes you're talking about different specific circumstances, but the problem that you're discussing is the same. Nothing gets resolved unless you deal with the roots of the problem. And so we find ourselves feeling like, is it Bill Murray in Groundhog Day? The same thing over and over and over again with different people. I used to know someone that was a serial dater, and he would date women. They all looked very different, but we realized in retrospect they were all the same person with a different face. He never dealt with the issue. He never asked, what is it in me that is attracting me to this person? And how can I break this pattern? He was blind to it. It was Groundhog Day over and over and over again. So that's the first problem. Nothing's ever solved. The second problem is that we become ticking time bombs. Has anybody seen the Michael Douglas film Falling Down? If you have, raise your hand. A couple of people. What about Office Space? Has anybody seen Office Space, right? This is a clear example of when people go postal, right? And this is the mild-mannered person who's sweet, and they're always compliant, and they do what you ask them to do. But inside, it's a boiling cauldron of anger, and they stuff it until finally they just explode. It comes out sideways. And when we don't process our emotions in a healthy way and deal with it very directly, and they come out sideways, it's almost always self-destructive and wounding to our relationships. And so not only is nothing solved, but as that problem is repeated over and over and over in your life, it gets worse and worse and worse, like a festering wound, until eventually you're going to lose your cool, and it's going to be a whole lot worse than if you would have just dealt with it at the very beginning. So these are a couple of different escape responses and the problems. Now let's go to the other side of the slippery slope and look at the attack responses. You might have found yourself saying, or you might have heard someone else say, I want my way. And if you don't give me my way, you're going to suffer. Have you ever known people like this? Even if they don't say it, that's the dynamic of the relationship. I want what I want, and if you give me what I want, then we won't fight. And if we fight, it's because you're not doing what I want you to do. And if you don't do what I want you to do, then you're going to suffer. I'm either going to call you names, I'm going to lash out at you, which we'll talk about in a minute, or I'm going to be real passive-aggressive and accidentally burn your dinner. I'm going to give you the silent treatment. It's going to be like a Cold War in the house. I'm going to pout, right? I'm going to come home late. There's aggressive and passive-aggressive ways that we attack people, but nevertheless, the attack response is, you give me what I want, or there's going to be you-know-what to pay. We're in church, so I won't say it. And this manifests itself in a couple of different behaviors, too. The first is blaming. Have you ever known someone that can't take responsibility for their own stuff? And so every time there's a conflict, it's almost as if they're incapable of looking inside and figuring out what their contribution is, and they're always just pointing their finger at somebody else. It's you. You're doing this. Like blaming, blaming, blaming. There's a great Christian psychologist named Henry Cloud. He's got a book called Necessary Endings. I'm going to be offering a sermon series on that in the future. And it's either chapter 7 or 9 of his book. It's titled The Wise, the Foolish, and the Evil. And he said that the biblical definition of a fool is someone who cannot receive feedback. So they're in a conflict and someone comes up to them and tries to work it out, and they're incapable of receiving the feedback, owning their own part, making an apology, and doing whatever they need to do on their part to make the relationship right, because they're always pointing the finger at somebody else. And we know that, the obvious way that we do this is by looking at someone and saying, it's your fault, right? But there's also other ways of doing it. Sometimes, even in the church, I know it's going to be a shock to a lot of you, but even in the church, sometimes, instead of looking at someone and saying it's your fault, we get in parking lot conversations, email exchanges, we get behind closed doors, and we retell the story of what happened over and over and over again, where we are the innocent hero and the other person is the guilty, vile sinner that needs to repent. If you're telling a story of conflict to someone that you're not having conflict with, and you're telling the story in a way that makes the other person seem like they're always the one doing something wrong, a red flag ought to go up in your mind. Because it takes spark, gasoline, and fire for an argument to really get any traction. If you don't know what I'm talking about, listen to the message from next week. There's always two in a conflict. And not only do we tell people in more aggressive ways, you're to blame, and not only do we have the parking lot conversations and backdoor conversations where we're painting the other person as the one who's always guilty, failing to see our part, but we can also tell that story right here. Have you ever done this? We all do it. The story that we tell ourselves about the conflict, just the internal dialogue that we might not even share with someone else, is often, woe's me. If that person would just get their act together and do what they're supposed to do, then everything would be fine. And again, that is the blaming response that is tied to attack. One of the worst forms of blaming comes through gossip and backbiting. And it's one of the most deadly sins in a church. If we cannot be gracious and kind to one another, we cannot be forgiving and generous, if we gossip and we backbite, it is like having the Ebola virus in the church. It will liquefy us from the inside out and destroy any church. And again, it's part of that blaming. We're gossiping by talking about someone else in hopes that the person that we're talking to will see that the other person is to blame. And then, of course, there is the obvious manifestation of the attack response called assault. We assault people. And we know, the most obvious form of this is when we actually use physical force to intimidate or cause someone harm. And to use your body in a physical way to assault someone doesn't just mean punching and slapping and pushing and those things, which all of us know are wrong. We were taught that when we were children. But have you ever seen someone who's kind of big and they're not winning the argument and they will posture their body in a way to try to communicate a threat to you? They'll bow up their chest. They'll grit their teeth, stare at you. They'll jump like that. There's ways that we can use our body to manipulate people into doing what we want them to do through threat. I'm going to threaten you and use power in hopes that if I scare you, you will give me my way. That's the obvious attack response. But what about this? What about verbal attacks? If you've had an introductory course in college on psychology, you will very quickly learn that there's not only physical abuse, there's also emotional and verbal abuse. And I believe in the church there's spiritual abuse. I believe there's a lot of people who love Jesus and want to grow in their faith, but they stop coming to church because they were part of a spiritually abusive congregation who were not faithful witnesses to the good news of the gospel and caused more harm than good. And a lot of people leave the church for that reason, and they don't come back until years later after they're at their wits' end and they need support. That's our fault if that happens. So there's not only physical abuse, there's also emotional and spiritual abuse. And one of the ways that we emotionally and spiritually abuse people is through verbally attacking. It's using threats to intimidate people. You guys, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's like the married couple who every time they get in a fight, one of them says to the other who is a little more insecure, well, I'll just leave. I'll divorce you. How you like that? And they say those words because they know that the other person is going to be flooded with anxiety, capitulate in the argument, and try to smooth things over by giving them their way. Well, if you don't do what I want you to do, then I'll have the divorce papers on your desk by tomorrow. By the way, if you're that person, that jig will be up very soon, because the other person, as much as they will smooth it out in the moment, will gather resentment and bitterness towards you, and then there's going to be one time when you're going to say, I'll get the divorce papers ready, and they're going to say, I've already got them, just sign here. That's that going postal I was talking about, right? But it's saying things like, well, maybe we'll divorce. Or at work, have you ever had a boss that doesn't know how to lead effectively, and they lead from a position of power? And as an employee, if you don't do what they ask you to do, they say, well, do you really like working here? Because, there's a lot of people who would really like working here. That's intimidation through threat. And even if you don't mean it, even if it's just a ploy to get your way, using threats to manipulate people is a form of verbal assault, and it's wrong. And so we've now seen the escape responses and the attack responses, and all of us use these different things at different times. So there might be times when you try to avoid conflict at all costs. There might be other times when you run away from it. There might be other times when you verbally just attack someone. There might be other times when you blame. We're all capable of this as fallen human beings. But what I want to say to you is that most of the time, we have a natural default response. Which means when you are who you are and you feel threatened, you will probably tend toward either escape responses or attack responses. And it's very important for us to be self-aware and to know which response that we tend to go to, because both of them, are you ready, church? Both of them will destroy your most important relationships. They'll cause you to lose your job. They'll get you divorced. They'll cause you to lose friends who will just stop calling you. They'll cause you to be without support in the church. Right? These are unhealthy, destructive responses. And so I want you to be thinking today and throughout the week, what is my default response? Is it to run away or is it to fight? And what I want to tell you this morning is that the Bible says there's a middle way that will not break and wound your relationships, but will actually bring healing to your relationships and make them better than ever. The Bible says we shouldn't run away from conflict. We've got to face it honestly. Honesty is an important virtue in the Christian faith, so we've got to deal with it in an honest way. But on the other hand, the Bible says we shouldn't attack people, because the way that we respond ought to be loving, and it ought to bring healing, not hurt. And so what is the middle way? It's healing the relationship through reconciliation. That's God's way. God's way is not running away from the problem or attacking people to win every argument and get your way. It's trying to map a middle way in which the relationship is healed, and it's healed through a fair and mutual resolution so that the two people can be genuinely reconciled. I want you to think about it. Whenever we are dealing with conflict, our natural response is to focus on the specific issue. You were short with me. You didn't do what I asked you to do. You called me a name. Whatever the case might be, that spark hits. And what we tend to do is zero in on the problem, and then our brain starts creating problem-solving techniques. How can I solve the problem? And so our typical way of dealing with conflict is to focus on solving the issue. But this is not God's way. God's way makes healing the relationship the number one priority. Here's why. If you focus on healing the relationship first and can be reconciled, then you can get together as a partner and you can solve the problem together. So solving the problem and being reconciled are not the same thing. I'll give you an example. As a pastor, I have a lot of night meetings, and I work a lot in the morning too. So if I'm going to get a break during the day, sometimes it comes around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and don't laugh, but one of my guilty pleasures is I like to watch Judge Judy. Okay? And I remember seeing an episode of Judge Judy in which 2 adults came in that were brothers and sisters, and they were fighting over their mother's estate. These 2 people had been very close growing up. Their mother passed away. There was a dispute about how the property would be divided, and it created an incredible wound in their relationship. Walls went up. They weren't talking to each other, and when they did talk to each other, they fought about it. And they came before Judge Judy, and in good Judge Judy fashion, in about 15 minutes, she solved the issue. She looked at the will, she listened to the testimony, and she said, okay, I'm going to fix this. You're going to get this property, you're going to get that property, court is adjourned. Now, were they reconciled? They walked out into the hallway, that guy that's got the microphone where he interview people and it goes back and forth. You know what I'm talking about. Y'all watch Judge Judy sometimes too, right? And in that interview, even though the problem had been solved, they were saying nasty things about each other because they weren't reconciled. You have to be very careful if you focus on the solution, because the solution that you get might very well contaminate the relationship for years to come. Remember the old saying, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it? Sometimes you get your way and you realize in retrospect, man, it would have been so much better if I would have just said, it's okay, our relationship is more important than this stuff. And if you're dealing with those kind of issues, I'm not saying that you're wrong. Sometimes we do need resolution because some folks in the conflict are unreasonable and we need the help of the courts. But my point here is quite simple, and it's that you can solve an issue without being reconciled. And God's way says, first you heal the relationship and get reconciliation. Then that reconciliation will determine precisely how you deal with the issue. Does that make sense? If the goal is to get your way, you're going to use a different method. If your goal is to heal the relationship and be reconciled, then that goal is going to shape the path that you take to resolve the issue. And if you can heal the relationship and work together at a solution, that solution's probably, most of the time, going to be a whole lot better. So, God's way maps a middle way between escape and attack. And so the question is, how do we do this? How do we develop a process where we can follow God's way and come out better for it? And this morning, I just want to briefly mention what Ken Sande, whose book we're using for this series, calls the 4 G's. God's way is characterized by 4 G's, G as in go. Okay? And this morning, I am only going to briefly mention them because what we're going to do over the next 4 weeks is we're going to take each of these practices and we're going to dive in, we're going to learn deeply about them, and I'm going to teach you some practices to apply these principles so that at the end of 4 weeks, you're going to have a path that's going to help you follow God's way in resolving conflict. So today, I just want to mention them. That's what we're going to be covering in the next 4 weeks. But here's the last thing I want to say to you. Before we start looking at God's way for resolving conflict in these 4 steps, I want to give you some good news this morning, and that's this. Sometimes it is possible and appropriate to stop a conflict before it ever happens. Not always, but sometimes it's appropriate and possible to stop the conflict before it ever happens. And it's through what I call preemptive forgiveness. It says in Proverbs 19:11, a person's wisdom yields patience. Wisdom is connected with patience. You know? We can tolerate discomfort for a while without compulsively reacting. But listen to what it goes on to say. It is to one's, what, church? Glory to overlook a what? An offense. Wisdom. Have you known some wise people? My grandmother was very wise. There are some senior adults in every congregation I've served who are very wise. And you can tell they're wise partly because they are patient and they are gracious. People that are impatient and harsh are still working on wisdom. I just want to give you a quick example. Don't advance the slide yet, Emma, because I want to set this up appropriately. I want to give you an example of how sometimes you just need to let it go and move on. When I moved into my house in Lakeland, the last house that I lived in, we didn't have mailboxes in front of the house. We had this big metal square structure that had little boxes with keys, and we all had to go and get our key. And the interesting thing is that this box was literally right across the street from my house. And so I got into the habit, as many people did, of driving up as close to that box as I could because my mailbox was at shoulder level, and I could roll down my window, and I could open the key and take my mail, and everything was great until the guy who lived on the corner lot started putting objects on the corner to prevent people from doing that. And I got mad. How dare this guy make me get out of my car to check my mail, right? And I was mad. And the first thing he did is he put a wooden stake in the ground, right? And somebody, I don't know who it was, but somebody took it out and just laid it on the ground so that we could continue to drive on the car. It wasn't me, right? It wasn't me. Just driving. And then he got a piece of the rebar metal, and he pounded that in the ground. And that only lasted for a little while, and somebody in the neighborhood, because I wasn't the only person doing this, eventually pulled it up and laid it on the ground. One day I came home from work, and this is what I saw. This guy got a metal tube and filled it with concrete and put it in the ground so nobody could take it out. I was livid. How dare this guy permanently put something that's going to keep me from being able to get my mail out of my window. And when I saw this guy, I just got flooded with anger. Have you felt that way? My face turned red, and I had several options here, right? And I'm a pastor, so it limits my options. But here's the thing. He didn't know I was a pastor, so I probably could have gotten away with some more stuff. But, you know, I could have gone and knocked on the guy's door. Hey, man, how dare you do that? And I could have given him a piece of my mind. But he was bigger than me, so I decided not to do that. Right? I could have written a letter to the Homeowners Association and said, check out the legality of this. I could have been passive-aggressive, and when he drove by and waved, I could have looked the other way. Right? Or what I really wanted to do is get up at 1 o'clock in the morning and dig that doggone thing out of the ground and lay it on his doorstep saying, nice try. A lot of responses here, right? But what I realized is that I was getting infuriated by something that was silly. I mean, literally, even with the post there, I could drive close. The only extra step that it took was for me to open my door and to take a step out to get the mail. That's all. And then I started feeling bad because I started thinking I'm getting really, really angry because I'm just lazy. Now I'm beginning aware that maybe it's a character defect in me, right? Or how hard is it just to walk across the street? Is the relationship with my neighbor more important than me getting my way about that stupid post in the ground? Of course it is. And so I decided to let it go. And I began to smile and wave, and I had to process. I still felt angry when I saw him, but I was able to let it go and process. Sometimes it's okay just to let it go. Are there any married people in the house? You got a great relationship, you love your spouse, you walk into the house, one of you has a bad day and snaps at the other. Right? You got a choice. I would encourage you not to nitpick. You can't be so hypersensitive to conflict that every time someone just rubs up against you in the wrong way, you go, okay, stop the races. We have to take out our conflict resolution manual and work the 4 steps of the G's to do it God's way. If that's what you're doing, it's going to rob you of your joy in life, and you'll do nothing but solve problems because people are constantly rubbing us the wrong way. Sometimes you got to let it go. And so in the situation with your spouse, if your spouse or your roommate or a family member comes in, your mom or dad comes in, and they've had a bad day and they're grumpy and they snap at you, ask yourself a couple of questions before you embark on a long conflict resolution journey. Ask yourself the question, does this person really love me? Yeah, they love me. Overall, do we have a good relationship? Yeah, for the most part we do. Do we sometimes mess up and lash out? Yeah, sometimes even I do that. Is it a big deal? Not really. In this bigger context, can I overlook the offense? Probably. Now we have to be very careful because you can't use if you are an escape person, just out of curiosity, you don't have to respond. But if you tend to be favorable to an escape response, raise your hand. A couple people here, conflict avoiders, right? Okay. If you're married, the other person's probably leans toward the attack response. But sometimes you've got 2 people who escape, and it's a cold war at home. And then when you get 2 attackers, it's like, really bad. Right? But anyway, if you tend toward an escape response, be very, very careful not to interpret what I'm saying right now as a way of legitimating your escape. Because when you choose to let something go, you're not ignoring it, you're not brushing it under the rug. It's quite different. When you ignore it and brush it under the rug, you build resentment and anger and hostility, and it hurts the relationship. But what I'm talking about is extending grace to someone in the same way that God has extended grace to you on something that is minor, that's not a big deal. And the way that you do that is you acknowledge the wrongdoing. You say to yourself, that person shouldn't have lashed out at me. But you choose to let it go and extend grace and say, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. If you have learned this lesson in life and it has made your marriage better, raise your hand. Everybody look around. Some things you just got to let go. Here are 3 questions you can ask to see whether it's appropriate to let it go or really dig in. Number 1, has the offense created a wall between us? Are we not talking anymore? Are we in separate rooms? Are we not calling? Number 2, is the offense causing any real harm? Is it really causing harm? And number 3, is the offense part of a destructive pattern? Is it happening over and over again, or is it just a one-time offense because they had a bad day? If you answer these questions no, if you say no, it hasn't created a wall, no, it's not causing any real harm, and no, it's not a part of a pattern, then guess what? The best thing to do is probably to let it go and extend grace. So, in summary, we have looked at lots of different responses to conflict. Some of them have been unhealthy, destructive, and sinful, and some of the things that we're learning are God-honoring and bring healing to our relationships. But today, I want you to leave by asking yourself this question. If I'm experiencing conflict, is it something that I can preemptively forgive and let go of? And as you pray about that and reflect on that, knowing that what's most important is not getting your way, it's not even solving the problem. The most important thing is healing the relationship and being reconciled, because loving relationship is the most important thing for God. And if knowing that, you ask these questions, and it's time to let it go, I want to invite you to experience the freedom that comes with that release. Will you do that this morning? If you will, say amen. We're going to invite the musicians to come forward, and I'm just going to lead us in a very short prayer, then we're going to sing our closing song this morning. Would you please join me in prayer?